And I feel like you're describing something that so many people who have experienced a devastating loss or change come to, like, who am I now? Who am I after all of this? Because everything that I knew before is gone. Now your situation is has some extra layers to it because you've been in that process of, I will no longer allow people a seat at my table if they are not going to treat me with respect. Right. So it's not just a loss that made you question your identity. It's also, who am I now that I get to choose who sits at my table? I'm not even sure who the me is who sits here. One, I want to just acknowledge and validate how overwhelming that can feel and how lonely that can feel when you're not even sure you're at your own table. We do know that loneliness and longing have seats at that table. So one of the things that I just heard you say was, like, all of the abusers are dead, go be free. And, like, it's a little bit more complicated than that, isn't it? Because when an abuser or an abusive person is alive, we're still in relatedness, we're still in relationship to them, whether it's avoiding them, or if we think about a model of the solar system, that planet of the abuser is still there, even if you are not in their orbit anymore. And it's still exerting some gravitational pull. What I hear you describing in that imagery is like that solar system just evaporated and you're sort of in that free fall of no gravity, no relatedness. I'm not sure if I'm a planet or an asteroid or any of this stuff, right? And it is true that you have an opportunity now to sort of meet yourself again for the first time, in a way like meeting yourself as though you were meeting a new person. How would you get to know a new person? What questions would you ask? It's like you're dating yourself. That is an opportunity, and this is something that we can explore. And at the same time, the collection of feelings that come with the necessity of meeting yourself again for the first time. Does that make sense? So, like, both of those pieces are true. We want to name and honor the fact that it really sucks that you have to do this. This is a lot of that learning to find out who you are without those big planets in your solar system, because you do still exist. You are still here. We just don't know who you are right now. This is a process of exploration and experimentation. If I am, in some senses, starting from scratch with this self, what are the values and the interests and the beliefs that I might like to form this new self with? That's sort of therapist speak. So I'm going to bring it down to a couple of examples, right? What do I believe? Do I want to create a self that believes in kindness? Okay, kindness is important to me. What would that be, right? Or silliness is important to me. It's not so much looking at or trying to think of, what do I like? What do I want to do? What am I going to do with my life? Because that is a lot of pressure that you do not need, right? So let's pull that back and look at, in this new life, because it is a new life, what do I want for myself? Don't think of objects. Think of, I want to have adventure in my life. I want to have play in my life. This looking back and saying, that's not me anymore. And I don't know who this is, but here are some things that I believe to be true, or that I want to make sure as I build from the ground up are part of my foundation. That's actually, I like that imagery. If I have to build from the ground up, what do I want to be part of my foundation? Kindness, respect, honesty with myself. If you have to build from scratch, what are the values and the needs that are at the foundation of this building, of this self that I am building from scratch? I just put into Google personal values list and it came up with a bunch. So Brene Brown has a list of values. I know Danielle Laporte has a list of values. And remember that you don't have to solve the rest of this life. You don't have to create an entirely new identity in 15 minutes. We are looking at your foundation. If I have to build a new self from scratch, what are the 4 to 9 things I want as my foundation? Don't worry about adding 216 things. Like that's building. That's not foundation. And when you get overwhelmed with all of this, you come back to all I need is a few things for the foundation to get started as I meet this new self. Call back that overwhelm when it happens. When you look at a list like this, and this is good for everybody here, if you're wondering, which so many of us are after a loss, who am I now and what am I supposed to do knowing what I've lived? This is a question that comes up for a lot of us month after month after month, right? Like, how do I figure out my identity? How you know if one of those core values fits for you is going to be different for different people. It's one of those things that people irritatingly say, you know, when you know, you get a sense of this feels right. It doesn't have to feel perfect, right? But it can be like, I could see that that's important to me, or I feel like that's an important one for me. So let me put that in this bucket over here. Got Brené's list of 100. You go through and 56 of those feel like that's important to me. Then you put those 56 in a bucket, in a list, in a Google Doc, and then you can go through and be like, if I had to choose between, if I'm only going for my top 5 and I have to choose between honesty and kindness, doesn't mean that if you choose kindness, that honesty doesn't matter to you. We're talking about, I want to get it down to 5 just as a starting place, right? You compare them and you say, if I can only have 5, which one of these makes sense here? Brené might even have, how do you sort these down? I think Danielle Laporte has some, how do you sort these down? But play with it. There's no definitive answer there. But I think that's a good place to start, is acknowledging the sadness involved in having to do this and starting that project of finding out who this new self is by looking at some of those values and beliefs that are important to have at the foundation of this new self. That deep loss of identity is so common for people after they've experienced some kind of loss, right? Like, who am I now? And from the outside, if you say that to people, they're like, you're still the same person. Go back to the stuff you love, like blah, blah, like all of that stuff. Not super helpful, right? Because it is those twinned things, that sadness, that grief over the fact that you have to find out who you are now, because who you were before this was pretty rad. And given that this is the life that I have in front of me, what do I want for myself? Looking for your values, looking for the things that are important to you as a foundation for this life that comes next. Those are really important steps, especially if you're not really sure where to begin.